Perfect. So thank you very much for being here in this seminar. This is the last seminar of the semester, and for this we have a pathway talk, which is something, a new format that we introduced, I don't know, almost 1 year ago, and it has been fascinating to know the different pathways of different women in network science. So today we have Brea Perry. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to present you in a little bit of, I'm going to tell a little bit about your bio, so please correct me if I'm wrong. So Brea Perry is a professor of sociology and affiliated faculty member of the Indiana University Network Science Institute. She began her career at the University of Kentucky before returning to Indiana University in 2014, where she received her PhD in 2008. Her research investigates the interrelated roles of social networks, biomakers, social psychology, and social inequality in health and illness, with a particular focus on mental illness and substance use disorder. She has a strong interest in longitudinal research, dynamic social processes, and quantitative methods, especially personal social networks analysis. Brea Perry has published, well, in many, many journals. She had also co-authored a book called Ego Networks Methodology with Bernice and Steve, and also a book called Personal Networks, Classic Readings and New Directions in Egocentric Networks, in co-authorship with Mario Small, Bernice Pescosolido, and Edward Smith. I cannot recommend enough both books. If you're interested in these kind of things, definitely they're very helpful, and I appreciate those. When she's not being a professor, Brea enjoys spending time with her family, hiking, playing soccer, and singing karaoke. And maybe something else that you can add right now, but it's a very big pleasure to have you here, and I leave you the stage for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks for having me here. Really excited. I love the idea behind your group. I think it's so important to lift women in network science up. I have been really excited to see more and more women entering the field. The longer I've been in it, I felt like a little bit isolated and alone in the beginning, and I think it's become more gender diverse, which, you know, makes me super happy. So really glad you're doing this. I think it's really important. So kudos to you all, to the organizers and whoever started this group. So I am going to give sort of like a half more of a career-oriented talk, half more of traditional research talk, because I feel like the research that I'm doing right now really illustrates super well how I've organized my career and how I try to use network theory and methods. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can you all see the right version? Yes, without perfect. The notes and stuff? Okay, great. All right. So I'm going to talk today about, so I study health, right, from a network lens, basically. And so some people will say, like, what health conditions do you study? And I'm like, I don't really care. I will study like almost any health related thing if I can apply networks to it. And the nice thing is you can apply networks to almost anything and it makes that thing better, I would argue. And so there is really not a single health condition I can think of that would not benefit from sort of a network perspective. So that's sort of how I've gone about my career, is trying to find paradoxes or methodological problems, theoretical puzzles that I can address and answer with network theory and methods. This really, so I started my career, I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, actually, when I started out. And I had worked for about 4 years at a psychiatric hospital, a state psychiatric hospital for children. And that was really eye-opening and illuminating. And that sort of made me realize that trying to tackle mental health issues from an individual perspective, like child by child, was not particularly effective when you understand sort of the family networks and communities that these kids come from. So that really made me sort of broaden my perspective and want to conduct research about, epidemiological research really about why these kids were so vulnerable to mental health problems to begin with. So I started working with Eric Wright, Eric Rini Wright, probably not the one most of you know, who's a sociologist now at Georgia State University. And he was studying mental illness from social network perspective. And I became the project director, and this is how I got interested in networks. We were essentially studying HIV risk and sexual networks of people with mental illness. So we would go around the state and go to different psychiatric hospitals and different community mental health centers and interview people with serious mental illness about their sexual networks and HIV risk. And it was fucking fascinating. That's all I can say. I was like, this is what I want to do. This is amazing. And he totally sold me on the network perspective. And he had been a student of Bernice Pescosolido. And so I decided to apply to grad school, and IAU was the only school that I applied to, which I would never recommend to anyone in retrospect. I had no idea how hard it is to get into grad school and to find the right fit. And I just happened to get lucky. So once I got to IU, I started working under Bernice. And so I have always had this network lens, really from the very beginning. So 2006, I published my master's paper, and it was on essentially applying theories of social network dynamics and disruption to foster care, trying to understand why some kids in foster care have much worse mental health than others. And I found that was linked to the number of schools that they'd been in, the number of different placements that they'd been in, sort of controlling for individual level characteristics. So this idea that social network disruption can be bad. And so I sort of started, and that was very much informed by my experiences in working in the hospital with kids with serious mental health problems. And so my career just sort of continued in that way, right? So, how can I understand why social networks matter for a particular outcome, and really trying to dial into social theory. And so that's what I did in this functional specificity article, where we're looking at health discussion partners and why those seem to matter more than sort of general discussion partners for health outcomes. We're often using mental illness or another illness as a case for testing social network theory. So it kind of goes both ways. You can understand epidemiology or the experience of illness by applying network theory and methods, but you can also test fundamental theories using the lens of health, because health is so important and obviously so driven by disparities and social processes. So it's great. You can go both ways. And in that way, I've been able to, I think, publish both in sort of really strong health journals, but also in generalist sociology journals, by arguing that health is sort of a flashpoint for, larger social problems and social processes. So, in 2016, I published this article on genetics, right? And how gene environment interactions are gendered because men and women experience social networks and the benefits of social networks differently. And just sort of goes on and on, looking at social influence and how that might be moderated by personality, in this 2019 piece with one of my grad students, Gabby. And so this is just sort of how my career has gone. And it's just so easy. I feel like if you look around in the health world, you read a little bit, about, a particular condition, to identify these areas where social network methods or social network theory is going to provide novel insight. And so that's what I just have always done. And I love, what I love about being a sociologist is that I can sort of change always what I'm looking at, what I'm studying. And, I've published in lots of different kinds of journals, from basic sociology to the most applied health journals. I published on lots of different health conditions. And always what anchors me is social network theory and methods. And you're able to do that if you have that as sort of your toolkit. And so I would just encourage you guys, you don't have to hammer the same nail for your entire career, right? It's really fun to sort of branch out, work in interdisciplinary teams, and you can learn new things, but still be anchored by your expertise in social networks. And so that's kind of how I've been able to be successful. So what I wanted to talk about today is just sort of walk you through an example of how I sort of shifted my research a little bit to study the social brain, which is kind of what I'm into now and have been into for about the last 7 or 8 years. So I started my career really focusing largely on mental illness and addiction. I applied a lot of social network theory to addiction as well. But I've recently become really interested in cognitive aging and in the social brain. And so I'm going to sort of walk you through like my weird brains process of like how I got interested in this and how I sort of discovered why there's like a really important role for social network theory and methods in this area of research. So I got interested in this really in around 2011, 2012. I started reading really interesting research about connections between social networks and the brain. So I'm also like a biosociologist. So I like dabble in like genetics and epigenetics and most recently neuroimaging biomarkers. So I'm just really interested in this sort of intersection of the social world and biomarkers, especially social networks, and how those are sort of borne out in biological processes. And so I started reading this super interesting research. So for example, Kanai et al. Wrote this really cool article about your Facebook friends, your number of Facebook friends being associated with the structure of parts of your brain that are necessary for interpreting social cues. And so I was like, oh, this is super interesting. But then of course I'm like, well, this could, this could go both ways, right? Like this could just be a social selection effect. Like maybe if you're, really good at maintaining, your brain is good at maintaining social networks, then, you're able to have a larger network. But then I started reading research on these rhesus macaques who are obviously fucking adorable. I probably should have been a primatologist. So that's like a failure in my career, is that I went wrong like pretty early and focusing on humans, because I could have like been hanging out with these guys and still studied social networks. But anyway, the cool thing about these rhesus macaques is that you can prospectively change their social network and then look and see what happens to their brain. So in this like by now pretty famous article by Sallet and colleagues, they took these monkeys and assigned them to different sized groups. You can also change their position in the social hierarchy, which is super cool. And then you can look and see what happens to their brain, so that they found that the parts of the brain associated with processing social information expanded and became more functionally connected if they were in larger social groups. And this is, of course, linked to the social brain hypothesis, and the idea that our brains really evolved to be as complex and amazing as they are, because it was adaptive to live in these more and more complex social groups. That's, Dunbar's number and that whole series of theories. So this is how I sort of got interested. And I was like, okay, so I really want to fucking study this. And people, I need to hook up with some folks who study brains. How do I do this? How do I get money to understand brains? Like, who's going to give me money for this? So I'm like looking around, thinking about like, how can I apply these ideas to something new, get funded to do it, and also like have people want to work with me and, and become interested in this research. So I started doing a little bit of reading on Alzheimer's disease. In case you don't know much about it, it's this, progressive age-related disease marked by brain atrophy. So your brain literally shrinks. You have a loss of cognitive function. They for a long time thought it was linked to these plaques and tangles, amyloid and tau in your brain. Now they think that might be a symptom, not a cause. Nobody fucking knows, which is great, because if nobody knows what causes it, then that's like wide open. Well, it's not great for people, but it's great for researchers, right? Because it then gives you an opportunity to say, like, what can I add to this epidemiological story? And it turns out, I think social networks add a lot. And like 2 to 3 years after I started studying Alzheimer's disease, NIA got a boatload of funding for this. And so now the funding lines have completely changed. And this has just been like an amazing thing for me personally, and probably for Alzheimer's disease research. So that was really fortuitous. So I started looking into this research. What do we know about social connectedness and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, or ADRD? And what I found, I was actually like pretty surprised that even going back to like 2004, 2006, people had been doing research on this already. So there was a pretty strong link established in the literature between older adults' levels of social connectedness, and that's like intentionally vague, and the onset and course of AD dementia. So there was like pretty good prospective longitudinal evidence. In the last like 5 to 10 years, there have been these meta-analyses. There are now like 6 or 7 meta-analyses, which really pretty firmly establish that there is this relationship between what your social network looks like over the life course and your subsequent risk of developing ADRD, and sort of the trajectory of cognitive decline once you have it. And so I'm like, okay, that's cool. What am I going to add here? And if you look a little bit deeper, what you find is that nobody really knows shit about the social and biological mechanisms, right? It's like nobody knows. They're like, oh yeah, like this connection exists. But then in terms of like, what are the actual specific social causes? What are the characteristics of social connectedness that matter? And what are the biological mechanisms that underlie that? Totally unclear, contested, really a total absence of a unifying theory, I would say, of social risk and resilience, like what's really driving this. And then just tons of measurement heterogeneity and imprecision. So these are just a few of the like social network measures that were being used. And you all have probably seen this if you study anything remotely applied, that what's called social networks is often not social networks, right? And so what I found is that the way that connectedness was being measured in this literature really did not provide a lot of insight into the specific social mechanisms, right? So is it close and supportive ties, or is it expansive networks that are heterogeneous, right? So you have no idea. And of course, for a social network person, that really matters and is very different. And so if you look at these measures, you could think like, okay, what are the actual mechanisms underlying the relationship between this and ADRD? It's very diverse. So I'm like, all right, I got this, guys. Like, this is an area where I can totally, I think, make some inroads just by really improving on the measurement of social connectedness. So that, and then applying theories to that. So that's sort of where I started. And so I started really just by reading a lot and by thinking about, what were the gaps in this area. And then I sort of dug a little deeper, and it became about connecting social network theory to plausible biological mechanisms that I could test. And so that's sort of where I went next. So on one hand, I thought, well, maybe social bridging, it really matters for this, right? So for here, I drew on theories of Coleman's theory of bridging social capital, Granovetter's strength of weak ties, Burt's structural holes, with the idea that the mechanism of social bridging really occurs primarily during irregular contact with more peripheral or dissimilar others with weak ties. And so, if you think about sort of the structural holes argument, it's like, okay, I sit as a bridge between these networks, and I can do like crazy Machiavellian shit and like hide information from people. And I'm in this like position of power. And that's how like you might use it in the corporate world. But if we're thinking about something like ADRD, you might get exposure to novel information. It might be harder to interact with people that you know less well. And so I'm drawing from social bridging this idea that you get novelty from your social networks, right? You get things you don't get with regular interaction ties, but I can then apply that to how that might affect the brain. And so that was sort of where I started. And then it turns out that is a really good fit with one of the key theories of resilience in ADRD called cognitive reserve. And this is really the idea that enrichment experiences across the life course provide resiliency or reserve against neurodegeneration. And so this had been looked at a lot in the ADRD literature, but focusing largely on things like education or occupation as sort of purveyors of this cognitive reserve. And so if you look at these pictures of brains, what this would look like. So just to interpret this for those of you who are not brain people, the reddish orange is amyloid burden, right? So amyloid is bad. That's an indicator of ADRD pathology. And so the left two brains, the one in the middle and the one on the left, those are both amyloid positive. So they have a lot of amyloid in the brain, which would suggest neuropathology consistent with ADRD. But the brain on the left has Alzheimer's disease because they have cognitive decline. The person in the middle is cognitively normal. So we would say that they have cognitive reserve. So there's this kind of disconnect between essentially how messed up your brain looks and your cognitive function that they think is explained by enrichment. And that's because your brain can sort of build new connections. It's like, if you know a city really well, you know all the shortcuts so you can get around the traffic jams, right? So that's sort of like a decent analogy for this. And so I thought, well, what a amazing match to a theory of social bridging, right? Like if you're getting all this social enrichment through your social ties across your life course, maybe that then makes you more resilient to neuropathology later in life. And then on the flip side of things, right, a lot of the measures that you saw listed earlier that had been tested before are really social bonding measures. And so here again, drawing on Coleman's bonding capital, theories of social integration, social support, especially stress buffering, right? Being in these sort of like tightly knit, small, kin-centered networks are really good for you. There's a lot of social psychological benefits. You feel like you matter, you belong, it reduces stress, right? And the effects of stress on the body. And so I thought, okay, well, this is another totally viable mechanism through which social networks might matter for ADRD outcomes. And it turns out that there are also really plausible biological mechanisms here as well. So social bonding might contribute directly and indirectly to brain health through neuroendocrine pathways, which have lots of sort of like secondary cascading consequences for the brain. So we know that perceived social support and loneliness are associated, for example, with variation in oxytocin and basal cortisol levels. Those things help you successfully downregulate the HPA axis when you're stressed out. And so because we know that stress affects your neuroendocrine response and affects the brain negatively, to the degree that social bonding reduces the effects of stress on your body, it should also have these beneficial effects for ADRD. So I'm like, great, I can test these things. There are some, biomarkers I can look at here. And I know how to measure social bonding, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm going to now set out to test these things. So we collected some pilot data. I paired with, we have the Indiana Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. These research centers, they're P30s, P30 grants funded by NIH. They're all over the country. And they're often, part of what helps them get renewed is by branching out to other disciplines and working with researchers who are sort of, testing slightly different things than what they're testing. So I reached out to the folks at the Indiana ADRC, pitched my idea to them and was like, hey, do you have pilot grants? They had this pilot grant mechanism. So I was able to apply to get a small amount of funding to collect pilot data. I convinced them that these things might matter, which was great. They're really wonderful to work with. And then I was able to partner with them, and that turned into an R01 grant. And now I think we're going to get funded this cycle for a renewal. And so it really was just about doing my homework on the ADRD side and convincing them that that social network theory and method was going to matter in terms of moving the needle. And it wasn't something they were already looking at or even was on their radar. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about sort of what we think we know after doing this research for about 7 or 8 years now, if you include the pilot study. So what are the social mechanisms? Is it bridging? Is it bonding? Is it something else? And then what are the biological mechanisms that underlie this? The study is called Social Networks in Alzheimer's Disease Study, or SNAD, which is the most unfortunate acronym ever. Another like career advice, don't start using an acronym that you don't like just because you're too lazy to come up with a good one, because it will stick and then it's impossible to change it later. So we're stuck with this. It sounds like something involving, I don't know, like a nasal disease, whatever, it's fine. So like I said, we partnered with this NIH-funded ADRC, and the great thing about partnering with clinicians is that they are collecting a ton of data that they have expertise in, and I don't have to do it. So it's way less expensive. So they collect like tons of clinical cognitive data. They do consensus diagnosis, which means like these neurologists get in a room and do like, decide like whether this person has mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease, which is way better than anything you could get from a nationally representative study. And then they collect tons of neuroimaging data. So they do structural MRI and functional MRI, PET scans, and then they allow you to use those data. So what we did is we went in and we added in-person interviews to collect social network data and other related social variables. And so we go into their homes during a separate interview that's sort of close to when they come into the clinic. And we do about an 1.5 to 2 hour interview where we're focusing only on social networks. Of course, this is the downside of like doing true social network data, is that it's extremely time consuming. It's not something you can really just like add to a survey and expect to get the data you need, especially because, as it turns out, and this is spoiler alert, social bridging and therefore peripheral networks really matter in this case. And you usually don't get those from, like an important matters name generator or something. So we collect true social network data. We use Network Canvas, which is like the most amazing software in the entire world. If you're interested in personal social networks and you want to collect this kind of data, I would highly recommend using Network Canvas. It comes out of Northwestern. They're amazing to work with. It's like free and open source, but if you want to do like, funny, tweaky things to it, you can do it, or you can pay them to do it. They're wonderful. So I'm sure you all know this, but we go through all the steps of eliciting names using name generators. We ask the follow-up questions about each alter, and then we collect data on alter ties. We do it on a touchscreen computer. Older adults love this. Sometimes my poor interviewers are there for like hours because they're so interested in their social networks and in the data we're collecting, and they tell lots of stories, and it's super, super cute, but it takes a lot of time. On name generators, we try to collect like a pretty extensive set of both regular and like semi-regular interaction partners. So we collect information about health and important matters discussants. That sort of gets at their core networks. And then we ask about any family members that they interact with regularly. So this is often extended kin. We ask about coworkers or people they volunteer with. We ask about neighbors. We ask about anyone else who's important they haven't mentioned, and then their study partner, which is that's not relevant. And so then we use these network data to develop measures of social bridging and social bonding, and then we have a bunch of things we can control for as well that would be potential confounding factors. So on the social bridging side, the variables we tend to look at most commonly are like network size, network effective size, density, minimum tie strength, which is sort of like how weak is your weakest tie, diversity, which is diversity of social roles. We look at age and racial and educational homophily. And then on the social bonding side, we look at things like number of close ties, support multiplexity, which is the number of different types of support processes or support functions provided on average, mean frequency of contact, quality of social relationships, those kind of things. And we use a latent variable approach, which works like insanely beautifully well. It's lovely. And so we struggled a lot kind of in the beginning because obviously all these measures of bridging and bonding are highly correlated with one another. And so, you can go to the theory, or, go to the literature and get like 10 different theories about which measure you should use to measure bridging or bonding. And what we found is they're all super correlated, and using any one of them does not sort of represent the variation that's explained by bridging capital. You have to kind of use all of them. Any of these will work by itself, but it works better and explains more variation if you use a latent construct. So I do really think that bridging and bonding, at least as applied to cognitive health, is a latent construct. And it's pretty normally distributed and super easy to work with, it turns out, in structural equation models. In terms of cognitive function, just so you know where we, the measures we're using, we often use what's called the MoCA, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It's a measure of global cognitive function. This is what it looks like here on the left. This is actually the, do you guys remember, I don't know, you might like literally be, well, some of you look very young. This is the test that Donald Trump said that he got a perfect score on when he was running the first time around. So it's like literally, what animal is this? It's like very, very basic cognitive screener, not an intelligence test by any means. So this is what we use often, because it's just a good measure of like different domains of cognitive function. But then we also have all these great measures of episodic memory, verbal fluency, processing speed, executive function, et cetera, which again is a real benefit of using something like the IADRC. And then we use quantitative neuroimaging phenotypes. So these are our primary biomarker for this study. They literally take pictures of the brain and then measure how sort of fat your cortical gray matter is. And you can do volume, like if you're looking at like the hippocampus or the amygdala, which we're often focused on, we'll do volume, but you can also look at the thickness of the cortex in various areas, because one of the things that happens in ADRD is your brain literally shrinks. And so this is a quantitative measure of that. Okay, so what are we finding? So this is just a picture of what network structure and composition look like by high and low cognitive function. So on the left, these are network ideal types. So we find like sort of what are the average network characteristics for someone that's about 1 standard deviation below the mean on various cognitive indicators. And then we build a network based on those average network characteristics. And so on the left, this is what sort of the average network of someone who's low cognition looks like. So you can see that it's entirely made up of kin. Ego is not in these networks, by the way. It's entirely made up of kin, and like pretty much everybody is connected to everybody else. If you look at the networks of someone who has a higher level of cognition, it looks very different, right? So you can definitely see that there's bridging capital here. So this ego, if they were in the network, would be bridging across multiple different components. It's much more diverse in terms of composition. This is not depicted here, but it's much more diverse in terms of strength of tie. And so you can see that in terms of sort of the expansiveness and the diversity of the network, there's a lot more richness there for people who have higher cognitive function than those that have lower cognitive function. So this is sort of where we started. And so this seemed to be an indicator right off the bat that there may be something beneficial about social bridging, or conversely, that something about having low cognitive function leads to your networks contracting. This is a really ugly figure, which is how you can tell that I made it and not one of my students. But so bear with me here. I will kind of walk you through it. So this was sort of my initial attempt to test multiple different potential social mechanisms. And so the sort of black section on the left is controls. The blue section is what I would call social participation. So this is like marriage, number of kids, do you work, do you go to church, do you volunteer, do you use social media? These are AMEs, by the way. The sort of like orange sliver is social stressors. So this is, have you experienced a major social loss, like, widowhood or divorce, or death of someone close to you? This is like, how much does your network hassle you, cause problems, or make life difficult? And then the sort of purple section is social bonding stuff, including non-network measures of social bonding, like perceived social support. We have a social integration scale. And then on the right are measures of social bridging, which are sort of the ones I've talked about previously. We also have like racial homophily in here and age homophily, both of which are associated with cognitive function. Something I did like sort of as like on a whim is we measure the number of phone contacts that people have. So we ask them to go into their smartphone and look and see how many contacts they have. That turns out to be like highly related to cognitive function, which is, I think, kind of cool, because your phone contacts are not like a contemporaneous measure. You like keep contacts in your phone for a long time. And although there are some like methodological issues with it, if you change phones or whatever, in general, it's like sort of a more backwards looking indicator of like your network expansiveness. But anyway, what you see across all these different potential mechanisms is that by and large, social bridging variables tend to be associated with cognitive function, whereas these other sort of social measures are not, with the exception of relationship quality of friends, which I think you could viably argue is a bridging measure. So then we can use these structural equation models to look at the effects of latent bridging and bonding on general cognition. So on the left, we have the MoCA, which is the sort of general cognitive function, but across lots of measures, especially those that are implicated in early stage Alzheimer's disease, you see significant effects of social bridging, but no effects of social bonding. And so we see an effect on MoCA, which again is overall cognition, but also executive function, episodic memory, and language, which are key to the early stages of ADRD. We also look at what's called theory of mind. And so some of you may be psychologists. If you're sociologists, theory of mind is sort of analogous to taking the role of the other. And it's essentially like, how well can you predict and understand what someone else's behaviors mean, what their intentions are, et cetera. And so I work with this like amazing and brilliant psychologist who studies theory of mind, and she shows these older adults pictures, and now we do little clips from The Office, the show The Office, and then asks follow-up questions. So it'll be like, you know, like why did Jim put Dwight's stapler in the Jell-O? You know, it's like super fun. Older adults love it. And it turns out to be a really good way to understand theory of mind. And so what you see here is that social bridging is associated pretty strongly with lots of different measures of theory of mind, but also with facial memory. So how well you remember faces. Social bonding is associated with a couple of things, but in general, much less so associated with these measures of social cognition. So we could think about social cognition as one possible mechanism through which bridging, you know, affects cognitive outcomes. For those of you who study social bonding and love social bonding, I don't want you to be disappointed in this talk. So you can see that when it comes to mental health, social bonding really matters, and bridging does not. So if you're looking at GDS as the geriatric depression scale, if you look at loneliness, happiness, these things are pretty strongly predicted by social bonding, but not by social bridging. So I have a postdoc who's doing some really interesting work on trying to understand, like, can you have both of these things? Because they're, you know, often sort of, you know, opposites. They're correlated in a negative direction. So what's the kind of ideal network for overall health, which I think is really interesting. We are now starting to have enough data to look at these things longitudinally. And so we can look at sort of bridging and bonding trajectories over time and how that's related to trajectories of cognitive decline. So we've been doing that recently. So these are longitudinal fixed effects models, which is a very conservative way to look at this. They're lagged. And so these control for all time invariant heterogeneity, whether we have the variables to measure or not. So this is all within person. So essentially it's like, as my social networks change, how does my cognition change in the next wave? And so you can see that for these like these three measures of cognition that really matter for ADRD, executive function, episodic memory, and language, that we still see these effects of social bridging, which is what we would want to see. And then I have this like amazing former grad student who is now at the University of Utah, who did some research using measures of occupational complexity. And this is like just such a like brilliant and perfect example of using a measure that was like not intended to test social bridging, but is like the perfect test for it. And the great thing about using something like occupation is that is obviously set early in the life course. So you're not going to see any reverse causation here with occupational complexity, right? And so what he found is that you can break down sort of occupational complexity of people, working with people, data, and things. And so working with people would be like maybe someone in HR, someone in the service industry. And the nice thing about this is it's not that correlated with occupational prestige either, which is kind of what you would want. Working with data would be like, you know, I don't know, like a data analyst who's just like sitting in their office, like on their computer all the time. Hopefully that's not you guys. It's bad for your brain. And then complexity with things would be like someone who works with their hands, like a watch repairer, or I don't know, obviously. Yeah. So anyway, but what he found is that across all these different cognitive indicators, and then also for diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment or dementia, that complexity in working with people in your occupation is really strongly associated with these outcomes, but not other kinds of complexity, which to me is like a like ringing endorsement of the idea that social bridging matters, but also tells you something about the brain's capacity for change and resilience that's associated with social input. So I really think like what this study has taught me is that the brain is really hardwired to accept social input and to change in response to social stimulation in a way that it may not be, or maybe less effectively or strongly tied to other kinds of complexity or stimulation. So now just like a little bit, I want to leave time for questions, but just really quickly on the biological mechanisms, I mentioned that we have these indicators of what's happening in the brain. So we've linked social bridging to gray matter density in the amygdala, which is sort of the social center of the brain. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for positive and negative emotion processing, especially around social situations. Fear conditioning around social situations, recognition of faces and facial expressions. So it's really like all the rewards and the learning and the emotional responses to social interactions, especially with new people. So it totally makes sense that you would see a relationship with bridging. And the great thing about this measure is that you see changes in atrophy of the brain decades before you see any effect on cognitive outcomes. So this again is helpful in terms of eliminating reverse causation explanations. And then we also see moderation of neurodegeneration by measures of social bridging, which is exactly what you would expect in a cognitive reserve scenario. So here, this is the association between amygdala atrophy and your general cognitive function. So what we would expect is that as your amygdala gets like smaller and more atrophied, it would be associated with a decrease in cognitive function. And that's exactly what we see for people who have low social bridging potential. But we see no relationship between underlying neurodegeneration and cognitive outcomes for people that have high levels of social bridging, which is just like beautiful and exactly what we would expect. So this is kind of what we think we're seeing here, is that, you know, sort of the ideal scenario if you're going to get ADRD is that you maintain your cognitive function for much longer. And then you sort of fall off a cliff and die. That sounds bad, but that's like way more preferable to a long drawn out period of cognitive decline, which is what we're seeing in these individuals that have weak bridging potential. And then another brilliant person that I work with, was my postdoc and now my research scientist, Sayun Pang. He developed this sort of direct measure of bridging where you can throw like every single brain measure that you have across all areas of the brain. You can put in amyloid burden and tau burden and everything we have and try to predict cognitive function. And then we use the residual as a direct measure of cognitive reserve. So in other words, if your cognitive function is better than we would predict based on, you know, 100 different measures of your brain, then that's an indicator of good reserve. If it's lower than we would expect, then that's, you know, low reserve. And so we can use that as our dependent variable. And again, like sort of triangulating using a different kind of analysis, we find really strong relationships between the latent social bridging factor and this residual measure of cognitive reserve. So hopefully, like by walking you through this, I've conveyed to you that I was able to extend social theories, specifically social theory on bridging, into a new area by thinking about like what are the literally almost at the biological level, or even just like at the interactional level, what are you getting from social bridging networks in addition to, you know, information that you could use or power in social relationships, right? That's kind of the traditional way that we think about bridging. But it also provides access to novel, diverse, and complex social stimuli. So in addition to being exposed to like different ideas, attitudes, values, new activities, literally you can think about it at the level of visual stimuli, like people whose faces are less familiar to you are more difficult to read, right? And so that's literally exercising your brain. Same with verbal stimuli, people with accents that are different than you, when you're speaking another language, right? Like all these are things that are more likely to happen when you have bridging ties. And just in general, it takes more cognitive processing to interpret the social cues of our non-regular interaction partners. So sometimes I'll talk about the example of like my partner. If my partner and I are like hanging out, often we're just like grunting at each other, right? Like we've been together a while, and so I know what she's thinking and she knows what I'm thinking without like a lot of cognitive processing on my part. But if I'm interacting with, a colleague, for example, that I don't see regularly, I'm like very attuned to what they're doing, and I'm working really hard to interpret, do they like what I'm saying? Do they not? What do they mean by that? Why did they make that gesture, right? Even almost without realizing it at a conscious level. And so that is neurological exercise, essentially, which could be driving cognitive reserve. And then, of course, there's really cool implications for health disparities. And this is kind of like where we're going next with some of this. It's really lovely to be able to say, hey, there are neurological benefits of being in diverse environments. Maybe being in a segregated environment is not so good for your brain. And so we're seeing, for example, differences in bridging potential across rural and urban communities that have implications for cognitive function. We're looking now at group differences in social bridging potential by education, by nativity, et cetera. And so we've sort of developed this model where we can look, sort of at the core social functions or social mechanisms like social bridging, social bonding, social stress, social influence. We can link those to downstream biological mechanisms, some of which we can currently measure and some of which we can't with our data. This is all theoretical, but then we can also look upstream to these social statuses that structure our access to social bridging or social bonding, things like gender, SES, race, ethnicity, rurality. Disability is not on here, but it should be, right? And so thinking about how differences in our social networks can affect the basic disparities in risk for ADRD. So really quickly, I want to acknowledge the people that I work with, who are all just totally fucking amazing. I could not do any of this without them. A lot of this work, they've contributed really great ideas or methods or whatever. So these are my people. So I want to say that. And then that's it. I'm happy to take questions. We have like 10 minutes. Sorry, I went a little longer than I meant to.
Oh, it was perfect. Thank you so much.